Kentucky at Georgia. The line is 14.5. Don't worry about that line too much. It was a lot higher at the beginning of the season. I think this thing opened right around a 3-touchdown favorite for Georgia. Georgia now, they're on the march. They looked pretty mortal last week against Auburn. Now, there's two ways to look at last week if you're a Georgia fan. One, hey, Auburn took advantage of some things. What are we if we're Georgia? Are we as good as we thought we were? Is this thing going to take shape soon? Is last year's Georgia this year's Georgia? Well, no, last year's Georgia isn't this year's Georgia, just by definition of it being two different teams. So we understand that. But the concern is, hey, Auburn in their first year with a quarterback and a passing game that threw for less than 100 yards gave us some issues, and it came down to the final drive. That's the concern level. On the opposite side of things, you can say, well, hey, Carson Beck, man, Brock Bowers, that offense, they answered the call to action. This team has a tremendous response mechanism, and they found a way in a rivalry setting, in a road game, to get it done. They're not what they are yet. That's fine. They're going to be a different team in November. We're not worried about that just yet. I think that's how you would like to gauge this if you're a Georgia fan. But this game will tell us a lot, because you got Kentucky coming to town. And Kentucky, man, they looked so good last week. Like, I sat right here, probably right around this time last week, and told you, hey, I think Florida's going to beat Kentucky. I think Florida will run the football. I think they'll play tough defense. Statement win for Billy Napier. We were, in fact, very wrong on that game. If you watched this game, it became very evident early who the bully was in Lexington, Kentucky, and it was the team coached by Mark Stoops, and that was wearing all blue head to toe, and they looked sick doing it. Hope they go icy whites this week. We'll see. Regardless, this is a tremendous opportunity for Kentucky. If you take down Georgia, how are we talking about Kentucky? Like, it's crazy to say, but at this point in time, if they beat Georgia, if we get to this point next week and we're like, hey, Kentucky took down Georgia in Athens, like, I think we're talking about Kentucky being in that playoff conversation. And it sounds wild coming out of my mouth, even saying Kentucky as a playoff contender, but like, that would be a world I think we have to consider Kentucky in if they beat Georgia. Very large if. We're going to break it down right now. Again, 14.5-point dog is Kentucky, but we'll see. We'll see. That's why they play the games. Big question in this game for me, Georgia fitting the run game correctly of Kentucky. And that sounds simple on the surface, but when you watch Kentucky and what they did last week, I mean, it was a clinic in how to pull offensive linemen. And I don't mean pull them from the game. I mean pull from one side of the line of scrimmage, run all the way around, and go fill up on a linebacker or a safety, whoever it was. They did that till their heart was content. That's an attitude thing. That's a physicality thing. That's an identity thing. And that's why Ray Davis went for almost 300 yards rushing. Because Florida, God bless them, they could not fit that to save their life. And when they fit it correctly, they did not have the physicality to match it. Now, Georgia, I think they are going to have the physicality to match it, but they can't bring that same physicality they had against Auburn. Because Auburn went for over 200 yards. Now, it looked different. It was more quarterback design runs. It was more read option, which, to be fair, is more difficult to defend than just a typical downhill run, because you have more blockers baked into that and you have some more responsibilities as a second level of the defense. But what I'm trying to say is, if Kentucky's able to get the ground game going a little bit, if Georgia can't fit this correctly, there will be chunk plays like we saw Auburn get against Georgia and like Kentucky got against Florida. Then they kind of start to impose their will. The second part of this, if you don't fit it correctly, well, then you start to have to address in other ways. Then you probably have to find some way to circumnavigate your issues in this, run fittage, if you will, and then some games in the pass game open up for Kentucky. Then maybe you have to bring some more resources down if you're Georgia, and then you leave Barry and Brown open, then you leave Tavian Robinson open, then you leave Dane Key open. Like, that was kind of the narrative going into the season for Kentucky was, hey, we got guys on the outside that can eat now. We got Devin Leary that can throw the ball. Like, we're going to be okay in the pass game. Can we run the football? And then you flip that conversation on its head right now with how Kentucky's able to run the football so effectively, and you're waiting for Devin Leary to really get it rolling. So the thing I think within that, if you're able to run the football if you're Kentucky, big plays in the pass game I think will be there. Now, you still have to hit on them. Has to be there if you're Kentucky. But it's a reality I think you would like to live in, and at least like to have a chance to swing that bat a little bit if you were Liam Cohen in that offense. Now, if you do fit it correctly if you're Georgia, if you just do what we expect Georgia to do and play really good defensive football, much like they didn't do last week against Auburn, and they kind of find themselves a little bit. I say, well, they played really well in the second half. We're being a little bit harsh on Georgia there. If Georgia rises to the occasion and plays the level of football we expect them to play, they take away the fastball for Kentucky, and you force Devin Leary to be consistent. He hasn't been that this year for Kentucky. He's right around 58% completion percentage. Now, Kentucky hasn't really needed him to throw the football a whole lot based on who they've played, but we understand they need him to start cooking, and you haven't seen him be consistent just yet. And if Georgia can put the game on him, I think you'd like to live that way, to be honest with you. A subplot within that, you get to rush the passer, right? If you take away the run game for Kentucky, probably goes without saying, you're living in 3rd and 7 or longer, and Georgia gets to go eat. You don't want to let this Georgia defensive line just pin their ears back and go eat. Not a way you want to live. I think for Georgia, going back to this, I think it requires that hard hat, lunch pail kind of mentality if they want to stop the run. Because Kentucky will force the issue. I promise you, they will force the issue. And they played Georgia really tough last year. Toughest game Georgia had, very quietly, was when Georgia went to Lexington and played them in a muddy, rainy day, weird game. They gave them their best game last year. So they'll need to make sure they bring that kind of juice. Now, offensively for Georgia, and this is the situation for Kentucky that I think is going to be an issue, Brock Bowers and the matchup versus Kentucky schematically. Like Kentucky's defensive coordinator, Brad White, and a Mark Stoops defense, you got to have some kind of answer for Brock Bowers. Because this was the backbreaker for Auburn last week. It just was. There's no way around it. Like this was ultimately what ended up being the death of them. Was Brock Bowers going for like 8 catches, over 150 yards, and a game-winning touchdown. Auburn played them pretty well for the most part. They did a pretty good job against the run for Georgia. But Brock Bowers was the difference. And Brock Bowers didn't have a crazy stat line in this game a season ago. I think he actually was limited pretty well by this defense. But let's not pretend that they're not going to try and feed him, is this Georgia offense. Let's not pretend that it's a quarterback of Stetson Bennett's experience level. I think Carson Beck will look for Brock Bowers early and often. I think that this offense will scheme up winners for Brock Bowers early and often, and I think Kentucky's going to have to deal with it. And so this is this is the luxury of sitting right here behind the mic. We get to say, hey, Kentucky, you got to stop Brock Bowers. Good luck. We don't actually have to do anything about it, right? Like, we don't actually have a game plan in place to stop Brock Bowers. Do you bracket him? Meaning like you play a zone around him essentially and try and make sure you have him bracketed is the name of the coverage. Do you double cover him? Do you assign a certain defender to him every single play? Like, I don't know how you do it, but you have to have answers, and you can't have him be the deal where it's just game over, Brock Bowers took over. Now, easier said than done, obviously, but I think that's a very big part of it. For Kentucky, though, I don't know that it's really about stopping him. I don't know if that's realistic. I think there's a very real case for Brock Bowers to be the best player in the country, regardless of position. I think ultimately, going back to what I said, it really is just about managing him. Can you just make it a game where Brock Bowers has 5 catches for 60 yards, maybe he gets in the end zone once, but he doesn't just end your whole day like he did against Auburn? Because if you can do that, you can kind of take him away just a little bit or manage him just a little bit. Then the game goes more on Carson Beck. And Carson Beck has played well to this point. I thought he played great last week against Auburn, even with that one interception. But his safety blanket is Brock Bowers. What does he do if he doesn't have the luxury of going to him as frequently as he wants to? What does that look like? Because I think Kentucky obviously will have to stop the run as well. It's a whole thing that goes without saying in this football game. They did not stop the run well last season. We'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. But as a whole, as much as you can put the game into Carson Beck's hands, if you're Kentucky, you got to live that way. Put it on Carson Beck, manage Brock Bowers, make them beat you some other way. That has to be the way Kentucky lives. Now, I think another thing that goes into this game that's going to be fascinating is the Georgia secondary against Kentucky's playmakers. Because we saw the Georgia secondary having issues is maybe not the right way to say it, but there was an acclimation period early in the game against South Carolina where South Carolina didn't have a great offensive line, still don't have a great offensive line. They put the ball in space early to guys like Juice Wells, to Xavier Legette, and they had some success with that. I think you have a Kentucky wide receiver room that has, I think, as many weapons, if not more weapons, that give you issues than South Carolina had. I don't know if they're the same caliber of Xavier Legette, who was like leading the country in receiving going into this past week, or Juice Wells, even when he was dinged up. But you have some guys that if you don't play fundamentally sound, if you don't rally to the football, if you don't tackle in space, they're going to get theirs. Like, they're guys that can absolutely hurt you. Berrien Brown, I think, is yet to really erupt. This might be the game where he's going to do it. If you're a Kentucky fan, you hope and pray this is the game where he does it. But they're all really good once they catch the football. It's not just a bunch of possession receivers. So I would expect Liam Cohen to try and get Devin Leary going a little bit with some quick game, with some bubble screens, with some tunnel screens, and get those elephants on parade on the offensive line and let them go try and block defensive backs. Like, I think you're pretty okay doing that if you're Kentucky. How does the Georgia secondary handle that? If they're able to snuff that out, then you take away the opportunity for Devin Leary to get in rhythm with those intermediate throws and those easy throws, and you force it back on him again to be consistent. It all goes back to Georgia. Can you force the game on Devin Leary and force him to be the one that beats you? I think that's what has to happen in this football game. Now, it comes down to this for me. When Georgia has the ball, is Kentucky able to win the line of scrimmage enough on first and second down? Not win the line of scrimmage, not win the majority of the snaps. I mean first and second down. Going back to what we said about Carson Beck. Can you force him to throw the football to beat you? And this is a risky game to play because I do think Carson Beck has the ability to beat Kentucky through the air. But, like, at the end of the day, you just can't have what happened last year to you. You can't let Georgia run for over 200 yards. In this game, Deion Walker, maybe potentially the most important player for Kentucky. 6'6", 348 defensive lineman. He wears number 0 and looks sick wearing number 0, to be real with y'all. If he can be the anchor and he can take on a double team and somebody else gets the running back and they're living in 3rd and 6 even, you'll live with that. You'll live with that. You say, okay, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 6. If we can get to that down in distance, let the chips fall where they may. But again, Deion Walker and the run game for Georgia is going to be crucial to be able to kind of have a physicality element about them. And Deion Walker stopping that is going to be the big old physical element for Kentucky in that sense. So, at the end of the day, as good as Kentucky is in my mind, as physical as they are up front, I think this is the game where Carson Beck rises to the occasion yet again. I think what he did in the second half against Auburn is a confidence builder for him. I think he's continuing to stretch the ball downfield. I also think that Georgia has some more weapons that haven't yet stepped up to the degree that they're capable of just yet. So I think that Georgia is able to have the pass game there, and I think that the physical piece defensively for them feels challenged from what happened against Auburn last week. They kind of had a get-right moment in my mind, having over 200 yards run against them. I think Georgia wins this football game. I think Kentucky does battle. I think that they are every bit as advertised. I think the final score is Georgia 34, Kentucky 24 in Athens. So Georgia just continues to march, continues to trend upward. And Georgia, if you win that football game, like we're expecting you and picking you to win that football game, like let's not have a conversation here on Sunday morning where it's like, hey, Georgia fans, don't worry, calm down, Georgia's okay. Like Georgia beating Kentucky, they're a good football team, is Kentucky. Like that is a defensive unit and an offensive unit, especially on the line of scrimmage, that's going to give you fits if you don't bring your hard hat and lunch pail. If you don't have some sweat in your socks or a little bit of a bad attitude when you wake up in the morning, like, they're going to give you issues. But I think Georgia answers the call. I think the Kirby smart way of doing things is enough, and I think Georgia wins that football game. Hey, y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also, be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.